The morning sun cast golden rays through the towering windows of Buckingham Palace, illuminating the freshly polished marble floors. Guards stood at attention, their red uniforms crisp and perfect. Everything appeared normal in the royal residence. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Camilla walked through the corridor with her head held high, her designer heels clicking against the floor. She had spent years cultivating her position, carefully navigating the treacherous waters of royal life. Now, as queen consort, she believed herself untouchable. Her schedule was packed with charity events, ribbon cuttings, and carefully staged photo opportunities. But what the public saw was only a fraction of what happened behind closed doors. In a small office, tucked away in the West Wing, Inspector Margaret Thornhill reviewed a stack of documents that had landed on her desk 3 months earlier. The papers contained allegations so serious that she had to read them twice to believe what she was seeing. Financial records showed suspicious transactions, large sums of money moving through accounts that should have remained dormant. There were emails, text messages, and witness statements that painted a disturbing picture. Margaret had worked for the Metropolitan Police for 20 years, handling cases involving fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. She had seen politicians fall, business leaders exposed, and wealthy families destroyed by their own greed. But investigating a member of the royal family was different. The pressure was immense, and she knew that one mistake could end her career. Yet the evidence was too compelling to ignore. The investigation had begun quietly, with a tip from an anonymous source inside the palace. Someone with access to royal finances had noticed irregularities in charity accounts. Donations that were supposed to help underprivileged children were being diverted. Money meant for hospitals and schools was disappearing into private accounts. Amounts were staggering, running into millions of pounds over several years. Margaret assembled a small team of trusted officers, each sworn to absolute secrecy. They worked late nights and weekends, following the money trail through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. Bank records were subpoenaed, witnesses were interviewed, and slowly, a clear pattern emerged. Camilla had been using her position to siphon funds from multiple charitable organizations, enriching herself while maintaining a public image of generosity and compassion the detective knew they needed. Ironclad evidence before making any move. One slip, one procedural error, and the entire case would collapse. The royal family had armies of lawyers ready to defend their interests, and the media scrutiny would be unlike anything she had ever experienced. But Margaret believed in justice, and she refused to let anyone, regardless of their status, escape accountability. Meanwhile, preparations were underway for the annual Royal Charity Gala, one of the most prestigious events on the social calendar. Celebrities, politicians, and wealthy donors from around the world would gather in the palace's grand ballroom. Camilla had spent weeks planning every detail, determined to make this year's event the most successful yet. She saw it as her crowning achievement, proof of her dedication to public service. The palace staff worked tirelessly to prepare for the gala. Florists arranged thousands of roses and orchids. Chefs prepared elaborate menus, and the royal orchestra rehearsed classical pieces. Security teams conducted sweeps of the building, checking every room and corridor. Nobody suspected that among the security personnel were several undercover police officers waiting for the right moment to execute their plan. Camilla reviewed seating arrangements in her private suite, adjusting place cards and making notes about which guests should be introduced to whom. She had become skilled at networking, using these events to cultivate relationships with wealthy benefactors. Many of them had no idea that their generous donations were not reaching the intended recipients. They trusted the royal name, never imagining that someone in such a position could betray that trust. King Charles was occupied with his own duties. Largely unaware of the investigation unfolding within his own household, he trusted Camilla to manage her charitable work independently, never questioning the financial details. The king had always preferred to focus on his environmental causes and architectural projects, leaving the social aspects of royal duties to his wife. As the gala approached, Margaret received the final piece of evidence she needed. Forensic accountant had traced the missing funds to a private account in Camilla's name, hidden behind layers of corporate structures. There were also communications. showing her direct involvement in instructing financial transfers. The case was complete. But the timing of the arrest would be crucial. The detective consulted with the Crown Prosecution Service, legal advisors, and senior police officials. The decision was made to execute the arrest warrant during the gala itself. It was a risky strategy, but they wanted maximum impact. The presence of witnesses and media would make it impossible for anyone to cover up the arrest or claim it was a mistake. Justice would be served publicly, demonstrating that no one was above the law. On the evening of the gala, guests began arriving in their finest attire. Limousines pulled up to the palace entrance, depositing men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. Photographers captured every moment, their cameras flashing as celebrities posed for pictures. Inside, champagne flowed, and the string quartet filled the air with elegant music. Camilla greeted guests with practiced charm, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. She wore an emerald necklace worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, a gift she had purchased with money that should have gone to sick children. She smiled warmly, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Margaret and her team entered the palace through a service entrance, dressed in formal attire to blend in with the guests, and they carried concealed identification and handcuffs, ready to make the arrest when the moment was right. The tension was palpable as they moved into position, watching Camilla work the room. The dinner began with speeches, praising the charitable work done under Camilla's patronage. Board members of various organizations thanked her for her dedication and generosity. The irony was not lost on Margaret, who stood near the back of the room, waiting for the speeches to conclude. Soon, everyone in attendance would know the truth about the woman they were applauding, as dessert was served. Camilla stood to give her own speech. She spoke about the importance of giving back, about using privilege to help those less fortunate. Her words were eloquent and moving, bringing tears to some eyes. The audience hung on every word, believing they were witnessing genuine compassion and nobility. They had no idea they were listening to a carefully crafted lie. When she finished speaking, the room erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically. It was the pinnacle of her social success, the moment she had worked so hard to create. The applause seemed to go on forever, echoing through the grand ballroom. Camilla basked in the adoration, believing herself triumphant. But then Margaret began walking toward the stage, her team following close behind. The applause continued, masking the sound of their footsteps. Guests noticed the movement but assumed it was part of the evening's program. Perhaps an award was being presented, or another speech prepared. Nobody suspected what was actually happening. Margaret reached the stage and climbed the steps, her face professionally neutral. Camilla turned, expecting to greet another well-wisher. Instead, she found herself facing a woman holding up police identification. The smile froze on Camilla's face as Margaret spoke words that would change everything. The color drained from Camilla's face as Margaret Thornhill announced clearly and firmly that she was being arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of charitable funds. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The applause died away as guests realized something extraordinary was happening. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Growing louder with each passing second, Camilla's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked around desperately, searching for someone to intervene, to tell her this was all a terrible mistake. But Margaret stood firm, flanked by two other officers who had moved into position. One of them held a pair of handcuffs, her metal surface gleaming under the chandeliers. The queen consort finally found her voice, though it came out shrill and panicked rather than with the regal authority she usually commanded. She protested loudly, claiming there had been a misunderstanding, that she had done nothing wrong. Her hands trembled as she pointed at Margaret, demanding to know who she was and under what authority. She dared to interrupt a royal event. Margaret remained calm and professional, explaining that she was Detective Inspector Thornhill of the Metropolitan Police, and she was executing a warrant issued by the Crown Court. She informed Camilla of her rights, speaking clearly so everyone in the ballroom could hear. The legal language echoed strangely in the ornate space, so out of place among the crystal and gold decorations, The guests sat frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. Some thought it might be an elaborate performance, perhaps a theatrical piece about justice or social issues. Others pulled out their phones, recording the scene even as security tried to stop them. The footage would be uploaded to social media within minutes, spreading across the globe faster than anyone could have imagined. Palace security rushed toward the stage, unsure whether to intervene or stand down. They had received no instructions about this scenario because nobody had anticipated it. The head of security spoke urgently into his radio, trying to reach senior officials who could provide guidance. But the situation was unprecedented, and there was no protocol to follow. King Charles was informed immediately and rushed to the ballroom. His face a mask of shock and confusion. He had been in another wing of the palace, meeting with advisors about an upcoming diplomatic trip. When he arrived at the scene, he found his wife surrounded by police officers while hundreds of guests watched in stunned silence. He demanded an explanation, his voice carrying the weight of royal authority. Margaret turned to address the king respectfully, but firmly. She explained that this was a criminal matter, that the evidence against Camilla was substantial and serious. She had been conducting an investigation for months, and the arrest was being made based on concrete proof of financial crimes. The king could review the warrant if he wished, but the arrest would proceed regardless of any objections. For a moment, Charles looked as though he might try to stop the proceedings. His face flushed with anger and embarrassment, knowing that this scene would dominate headlines for weeks or months to come. But his advisors whispered urgently in his ear, reminding him that interfering with a lawful arrest would create an even bigger scandal. The monarchy could not be seen as above the law, not in the modern era. Camilla began to cry, mascara running down her cheeks as the reality of the situation sank in. She clutched at the podium for support, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. The emerald necklace around her neck suddenly felt heavy, a symbol of the greed and deception that had led to this moment. She begged Charles to do something, to make it stop. But he stood paralyzed by shock and indecision. The officers moved to handcuff her, and she resisted, pulling away and crying out that she was being treated like a common criminal. Margaret pointed out quietly but firmly that anyone accused of stealing millions of pounds from charities would be treated exactly the same way. Wealth and title did not exempt anyone from the consequences of their actions. As the handcuffs clicked into place, gasps and exclamations erupted from the audience. Several women fainted, overcome by the drama unfolding before them. Others stood and began making their way toward the exits, eager to escape the scandal they had just witnessed. Still others remained glued to their seats, unable to look away from the spectacle. Media representatives who had been covering the gala scrambled to report the breaking news. Journalists typed frantically on their phones and laptops, crafting headlines that would shock the nation. Television crews rushed to set up outside the palace gates, preparing for live broadcasts. Within the hour, the story would be the top item on every news channel around the world. Camilla was escorted off the stage, her expensive gown trailing behind her as officers guided her through the crowd. People stepped back to let them pass, staring at her with a mixture of disbelief, pity, and judgment. The woman who had just received a standing ovation was now being paraded through the room in handcuffs. Her reputation destroyed in a matter of minutes. The grand ballroom, which had been filled with music and laughter just moments before, now felt cold and oppressive. The remaining guests spoke in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Some defended Camilla, insisting there must be some mistake or conspiracy. Others recalled odd moments over the years, small things that had seemed off but were never questioned. Representatives from the charities that had been defrauded sat in shock, realizing that the funds they had trusted Camilla to manage had been stolen. They thought about the projects that had been canceled due to lack of funding. The children who had gone without medical treatment, the schools that had never been built. The human cost of her crimes was staggering, and the full extent was only beginning to emerge. As Camilla was led through the palace corridors, staff members stopped their work to stare. Many of them had served the royal family for decades, and they had never seen anything like this. Some felt vindicated, having long suspected that something was wrong but lacking the proof or courage to speak up. Others felt betrayed. Having believed in Camilla's charitable work and defended her against critics, The journey from the ballroom to the waiting police vehicle felt endless. Camilla's mind raced, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. She had been so careful, or so she thought. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the falsified documents, all of it had seemed foolproof. But somehow they had uncovered it all. Margaret walked beside her prisoner, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the extraordinary circumstances. She had prepared for this moment for months, running through various scenarios in her mind. But nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of arresting a member of the royal family in front of hundreds of witnesses. The pressure was immense, but she knew she had done the right thing. Outside the palace, news of the arrest had already spread. Crowds began to gather at the gates, some supportive of Camilla and others calling for justice. Police reinforcements were called in to manage the growing crowd and ensure the situation did not escalate into violence. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as people debated the allegations and what they meant for the monarchy. Camilla was placed in the back of an unmarked police car, still in her evening gown and expensive jewelry. The contrast was jarring. A woman dressed for a glamorous party being transported to a police station for questioning. Photographers captured images through the car windows, and those photos would appear on front pages around the world the next morning. The drive to the police station was conducted with sirens and flashing lights, a security measure to prevent any attempts to interfere with the arrest. Camilla sat in silence, staring out the window as familiar London streets passed by. She had traveled these roads countless times in royal motorcades, waving to crowds and attending official functions. Now, she was seeing them from a very different perspective. At the police station, she was processed like any other suspect. Her jewelry was removed and catalogued, her fingerprints were taken, and her photograph was captured for official records. The indignity of it all was overwhelming. She was placed in a holding cell to await formal charging and questioning. The walls were bare and cold, a stark contrast to the luxurious surroundings she was accustomed to. Back at the palace, King Charles met with his advisors and legal team in an emergency session. They discussed damage control, public statements, and the constitutional implications of what had happened. The monarchy's reputation was at stake, and they needed to handle the situation carefully. Some advisors suggested showing support for Camilla, while others argued for complete distance from her legal troubles. The king struggled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, Camilla was his wife, and he felt a duty to support her. On the other hand, if the allegations were true, her actions had betrayed not just him, but the entire nation. He thought about the people who had trusted the royal name, who had donated money, believing it would help those in need. If that trust had been violated, the consequences would be severe. Meanwhile, the gala guests were being interviewed by police as potential witnesses. Many of them were prominent figures in business and politics. They cooperated fully, eager to distance themselves from any scandal. They provided statements about their interactions with Camilla, their donations to various charities, and anything suspicious they might have noticed over the years. The media frenzy intensified as more details emerged. Investigative journalists began digging into Camilla's financial history, her charitable connections, and her activities over the past several years. Every aspect of her life was being examined and questioned. Friends and associates were contacted for comments, and many expressed shock and disbelief at the allegations. The interrogation room at New Scotland Yard was nothing like the opulent settings Camilla had grown accustomed to over the years. The harsh, fluorescent lighting cast unflattering shadows across her face. The metal chair she sat in was uncomfortable and cold. Her expensive gown looked ridiculous in this utilitarian space, a reminder of how far she had fallen in just a few hours. Detective Inspector Margaret Thornhill entered the room carrying thick folders filled with evidence. She was accompanied by another senior detective and a legal representative, who would observe the questioning to ensure everything was conducted properly. They knew this interrogation would be scrutinized by lawyers, politicians, and the public. So every word and action had to be beyond reproach. Margaret began by laying out the evidence methodically and carefully. She presented bank statements showing transfers from charity accounts to private holdings. She displayed emails in which Camilla had instructed financial advisors to move funds in ways that concealed their true destination. There were invoices for personal purchases charged to charitable organizations, including luxury vacations, designer clothing, and expensive jewelry. The paper trail was extensive and damning. Over a period of 7 years, Camilla had diverted approximately £12 million from various charitable causes. The money had been taken from foundations that supported children's hospitals, educational programs for disadvantaged youth, mental health services, and cancer research. Each stolen pound represented help that never reached those who desperately needed it. Camilla initially tried to maintain her innocence, claiming she knew nothing about the financial details of the charities she patronized. She insisted that other people managed the accounts and that any irregularities must have been their doing, not hers. But Margaret was prepared for this defense and produced documents bearing Camilla's signature, authorizing specific transfers and expenditures. As the evidence mounted, Camilla's composure began to crack. Her lawyer, a high-powered solicitor who had rushed to the station within an hour of her arrest, advised her to remain silent. But she seemed unable to stop herself from offering explanations and justifications. She talked about the pressures of royal life, the expectations placed upon her, and the need to maintain certain appearances. Margaret listened patiently, taking notes but remaining focused on the facts of the case. She asked pointed questions about specific transactions, forcing Camilla to confront the reality of what she had done. When did she decide to take the first payment? How did she rationalize stealing from sick children? What did she spend the money on that was so important it justified this betrayal of trust? The questioning went on for hours, with breaks mandated by law to ensure the suspect's rights were protected. During these breaks, Camilla sat alone in the holding cell, the reality of her situation sinking in deeper with each passing minute. She thought about her life, about the choices that had led to this moment. She had wanted security, comfort, and respect, but her methods had destroyed any chance of maintaining those things. Outside the police station, the media circus continued to grow. News vans from around the world lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters stood in front of cameras, delivering updates to audiences in dozens of languages. The story had captured global attention, becoming the biggest royal scandal in decades. Public opinion was divided sharply. Some people expressed sympathy for Camilla, arguing that the pressures of royal life might have contributed to her actions. Others showed no mercy, pointing out that millions of people face financial difficulties without resorting to stealing from charities. Social media was flooded with commentary, memes, and heated debates about accountability and privilege. The charities that had been defrauded released statements expressing their shock and disappointment. Many of them launched their own internal investigations to determine the full extent of the damage. Board members resigned in embarrassment. Donors demanded answers about how such massive theft could have gone undetected for so long. The scandal threatened the reputation of the entire charitable sector at Buckingham Palace. King Charles held a meeting with his most trusted advisors to discuss how to respond publicly. The palace had issued a brief statement acknowledging the arrest and promising cooperation with the investigation. But pressure was mounting for something more substantial. The king needed to address the nation, to show leadership during this crisis. Royal historians were consulted about precedents for such situations, but there were few relevant examples. The monarchy had weathered many scandals over the centuries, but none quite like this. The combination of criminal charges, financial fraud, and betrayal of charitable trust created a uniquely damaging situation. The institution itself was being questioned in ways it had not been since the tumultuous period following Princess Diana's death. Prince William and other senior royals were contacted and briefed on the situation. They were advised to maintain distance from Camilla's legal troubles while continuing their own charitable work to demonstrate that the rest, the family, took their responsibilities seriously. Every public appearance would be watched carefully, every word analyzed for signs of support or condemnation. Back in the interrogation room, Margaret presented the most damaging evidence yet. She showed Camilla photographs of children who had been denied medical treatment because funding had disappeared. She read letters from families who had lost loved ones to cancer, who had donated money in memory of those people, only to have that money stolen. She wanted Camilla to understand the human cost of her crimes. For the first time, Camilla broke down completely. She sobbed uncontrollably, her carefully maintained facade crumbling into dust. She admitted that she had made terrible mistakes. She had convinced herself the money was somehow owed to her for the sacrifices she had made. She had felt underappreciated and undercompensated for her royal duties. And the access to charitable funds had seemed like an opportunity to correct that perceived injustice. Her lawyer tried to stop the confession, but Camilla was beyond caring about legal strategy. The guilt and shame she had suppressed for years came pouring out in a flood of words. She talked about the first time she had taken money, how small the amount had seemed and how easy it had been. She described the gradual escalation, how each theft made the next one easier to justify. She had told herself she would pay it back, that she was just borrowing. But that day never came. Margaret recorded every word carefully, knowing this confession would be crucial to securing a conviction. At the same time, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but the entire situation was tragic. A person, in a position of immense privilege and opportunity, had thrown it all away through greed and selfishness. As dawn broke over London, Camilla was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. She was informed that she would appear before a magistrate later that day for a bail hearing. The prosecution would argue that she was a flight risk given her international connections, and they would request that she be held in custody pending trial. Her lawyer would argue for release, possibly under house arrest with electronic monitoring. The morning newspapers hit the streets with massive headlines. Photographs of Camilla being led away in handcuffs dominated front pages around the world. Opinion pieces debated everything from the state of the monarchy to the oversight of charitable organizations. Editorial writers demanded reforms and investigations into other royal charities to ensure similar fraud was not occurring elsewhere. King Charles appeared on television that morning, looking exhausted and aged beyond his years. He spoke directly to the nation, expressing his shock and disappointment at the allegations against his wife. He promised that the royal family would cooperate fully with the investigation and that anyone found guilty of wrongdoing would face appropriate consequences. He emphasized that the monarchy stood for duty, service, and integrity, and that those values would not be compromised. It was a difficult speech, delivered with visible emotion. Charles struggled to balance his personal feelings with his constitutional role. He could not be seen as trying to influence the judicial process, but he also needed to show empathy for the victims of the alleged crimes. The speech was carefully crafted by multiple advisors, every word chosen for its potential impact. The bail hearing took place in a courtroom packed with media representatives and curious observers. Camilla appeared before the magistrate still wearing her gown from the gala, though now it was wrinkled and stained with tears. She looked small and defeated, nothing like the confident royal figure who had commanded attention just hours earlier. The prosecutor presented their case for denying bail, outlining the severity of the charges and the evidence against her. They argued that someone with Camilla's resources and connections could easily flee the country or attempt to interfere with witnesses. The sums involved were massive, and the betrayal of public trust was extraordinary. The defense lawyer countered that Camilla had strong ties to the community, that she had cooperated with the investigation once confronted, and that she posed no danger to the public. He requested that she be released to house arrest at a private residence. With electronic monitoring and strict conditions on her movements and communications, the magistrate considered both arguments carefully. This was perhaps the highest-profile case to come before her court in decades. She knew her decision would be scrutinized endlessly. She weighed the legal principles against the practical considerations and the need to maintain public confidence in the justice system. After a brief deliberation, the magistrate delivered her ruling. Bail would be granted, but under strict conditions. Camilla would be confined to a specific residence away from royal properties. She would wear an electronic ankle monitor and surrender her passport. She would have no contact with potential witnesses or access to financial accounts. Any violation of these conditions would result in immediate incarceration. As Camilla was led from the courtroom to be processed for release, protesters outside chanted for justice. They held signs demanding accountability and expressing anger at the betrayal. Police maintained order, but the anger was palpable. People felt personally violated by someone they had trusted to represent the best of British values and traditions. The residence chosen for Camilla's house arrest was a modest property far from London, owned by a distant relative who agreed to allow its use. It was a far cry from the palaces and estates she had called home, with basic furnishings and no staff. She would be essentially alone with her thoughts and the consequences of her actions. The legal process would take months or even years to complete. There would be additional investigations, pre-trial motions, negotiations about evidence, and eventually a trial that would captivate the nation. Every detail would be examined, every transaction scrutinized, every victim given a voice. 6 months after the dramatic arrest at the Royal Charity Gala, the trial of Camilla, Queen Consort, began at the Central Criminal Court in London. The Old Bailey, as it was commonly known, had hosted countless historic trials over the centuries, but none quite like this. Security was unprecedented, with armed officers positioned throughout the building and metal detectors screening everyone who entered. The courtroom itself was packed to capacity every single day of the trial. Journalists from around the world occupied the press gallery, their laptops and notepads, ready to capture every word spoken. Members of the public who had queued for hours, hoping to secure one of the limited public gallery seats, watched intently. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as history unfolded before their eyes. Camilla entered the courtroom each morning, looking vastly different from the polished royal figure the public had known. The months of house arrest had taken their toll. Her hair had grayed noticeably, and she wore simple conservative clothing rather than designer outfits. She sat in the dock with her legal team nearby. Avoiding eye contact with the spectators and cameras, the prosecution team, led by a highly experienced barrister known for handling complex fraud cases, laid out their evidence methodically over several weeks. They presented bank statements, email correspondence, witness testimony, and forensic accounting reports. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an overwhelming case of deliberate, disdained theft from charitable organizations. Witnesses came forward one after another to testify. Charity workers described how funding shortfalls had forced them to cut vital programs. Parents spoke tearfully about their children who had been denied medical treatments because the money simply was not there. Financial experts explained how the fraud had been conducted, detailing the complex web of transactions designed to hide the theft. One of the most powerful testimonies came from a mother named Sarah Mitchell, whose teenage son had needed experimental cancer treatment that the charity was supposed to provide funding for. She stood in the witness box, her voice shaking but determined. She explained how they had been told the money was unavailable. Her son had died 6 months later. She looked directly at Camilla and asked simply, "Why was your jewelry more important than my child's life?" The courtroom fell silent after Sarah's testimony. Even hardened legal professionals felt the emotional weight of her words. Camilla sat with her head bowed, unable or unwilling to meet the mother's gaze. The defense lawyer wisely chose not to cross-examine Sarah, knowing that any aggressive questioning would appear heartless and damage their case further. The defense strategy centered on attempting to portray Camilla as someone who had been overwhelmed by the pressures and expectations of royal life. They brought in psychologists who testified about the stress of living under constant public scrutiny. Character witnesses spoke about the charitable work she had done that was legitimate. They tried to paint a picture of someone who had made terrible mistakes, but was not fundamentally a bad person. However, the defense faced an uphill battle. The prosecution effectively countered each argument by pointing to the calculated nature of the fraud. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment or a single impulsive act. The evidence showed systematic theft over 7 years, involving numerous transactions and careful planning to avoid detection. The prosecution argued that someone capable of such sustained deception could not claim to have been simply overwhelmed or confused. Camilla herself eventually took the stand, a decision her lawyers had debated extensively. She spoke in a quiet, subdued voice, so different from the confident tones she had used during her years as a public figure. She admitted to taking the money and acknowledged the harm her actions had caused. She claimed she had convinced herself she was entitled to the funds as compensation for her unpaid royal duties. Under cross-examination, prosecution was relentless but professional. They walked her through specific transactions, forcing her to admit that she had knowingly diverted money meant for sick children to purchase luxury goods for herself. They presented receipts showing she had spent charity money on expensive vacations, designer handbags, and jewelry while children went without medical care. The trial lasted nearly 3 months, with both sides presenting exhaustive evidence and arguments. Legal analysts debated the likely outcome on television every evening. Though most agreed the evidence against Camilla was overwhelming, the public remained deeply divided, with some expressing sympathy while others demanded the harshest possible sentence. King Charles attended only one day of the trial, sitting in the public gallery with his face carefully neutral. It was a brief appearance, but it sent a clear message about where the monarchy stood. The institution would not protect someone who had betrayed the public trust, even if that person was the queen consort. The king had already begun quietly arranging for Camilla to be stripped of her royal titles pending the outcome of the trial. Throughout the trial, more revelations emerged about the scale of the fraud. Investigators discovered additional hidden accounts and unreported transactions. The total amount stolen was revised upward to nearly £15 million. Each new discovery generated fresh headlines and renewed public outrage. The charity sector itself underwent a period of intense scrutiny and reform. Parliament held hearings about oversight and accountability in charitable organizations. New regulations were proposed to prevent similar frauds in the future. The Charity Commission launched investigations into dozens of other organizations to ensure no similar misconduct was occurring. Finally, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the case went to the jury. 12 ordinary citizens were tasked with deciding the fate of someone who had been, until recently, one of the most prominent figures in the nation. They deliberated for 5 days, carefully reviewing the evidence and discussing the legal standards they had been instructed to apply. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Camilla stood to hear the verdicts, her hands gripping the rail of the dock for support. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged teacher from North London, stood and delivered the verdicts in a clear, steady voice. Guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of charitable funds. The evidence had been too strong to reach any other conclusion. Camilla swayed slightly. The verdicts were read, but remained standing. Her lawyer put a steadying hand on her shoulder. Around the courtroom, there were gasps and whispers. Some people nodded in satisfaction while others shook their heads sadly. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentence reports to be prepared. The day of sentencing arrived with even more media attention than the verdict had generated. People debated what the appropriate punishment should be. Some argued for leniency, citing her age and the public humiliation she had already endured. Others demanded significant prison time to send a message that nobody was above the law, regardless of their status or position. The judge, Dame Elizabeth Pemberton, was known for her fairness and her carefully considered sentences. She had reviewed all the evidence, the pre-sentence reports, and submissions from both prosecution and defense. She also read dozens of victim impact statements from people whose lives had been affected by the fraud. When she delivered her sentence, Dame Elizabeth spoke at length about the seriousness of the crimes. She noted that Camilla had been in a position of enormous trust and privilege, and she had abused that position systematically and repeatedly. The victims were among the most vulnerable members of society, people who desperately needed help that never came because of her greed. The judge sentenced Camilla to 8 years in prison. She would serve at least half of that time before being eligible for parole. The sentence was substantial, reflecting the severity of the crimes, but not as harsh as some prosecutors had hoped for. The judge explained that she had considered Camilla's age, her cooperation once confronted, and her genuine remorse. But these factors could not outweigh the magnitude of her betrayal. Camilla showed no emotion as the sentence was delivered. She simply nodded slightly, as if she had expected this outcome. She was immediately taken into custody and transported to a women's prison to begin serving her sentence. The images of her being led from the courtroom in handcuffs for the second time were broadcast around the world. King Charles released a statement expressing his sorrow over the situation and his hope that justice had been served. He announced that Camilla would be stripped of all royal titles and privileges, and their marriage would be dissolved. The monarchy needed to move forward without the shadow of this scandal hanging over it. It was a painful, personal decision, but a necessary one for the institution. The prison where Camilla would serve her sentence was a medium-security facility for female offenders. She was not given any special treatment beyond standard security measures to protect high-profile inmates. She shared a small cell, 8 in the communal dining hall, and was expected to participate in prison work programs like every other prisoner. Life in prison was a profound shock to someone who had lived in palaces and been waited on by staff. Camilla had to adjust to the rigid routine, the lack of privacy, the company of other women who had no particular reverence for royalty. Some inmates were hostile, viewing her as a symbol of privilege and injustice. Others were indifferent, focused on serving their own time and getting back to their families. Over time, Camilla found her place in the prison community. She worked in the library, helping other inmates improve their reading skills. She participated in educational programs and counseling sessions. She wrote letters of apology to as many victims as she could identify, though many of those letters went unanswered. Some victims found closure in her imprisonment, while others felt no sentence could truly make up for what they had lost. The charities that had been defrauded began the long process of recovery. Some of the stolen money was recovered through asset seizures and legal proceedings, though much of it was gone forever. Donors stepped forward with replacement funding when they learned how their original contributions had been misused. The affected charities worked to rebuild trust and demonstrate their commitment to transparency and accountability. The scandal had lasting effects on the royal family and the monarchy as an institution. Public trust had been severely damaged, and it would take years of consistent, genuine service to rebuild it. Prince William and other senior royals threw themselves into their charitable work, determined to show that they took their responsibilities seriously and would never betray the public trust. Reforms were implemented across all royal charities. Independent auditors were appointed, financial oversight was strengthened, and strict protocols were established for managing donations and expenditures. The royal family became more transparent about their finances and their charitable activities, publishing detailed annual reports that could be scrutinized by the public and the press. As time passed, the intense media focus on the scandal gradually faded, though it was never entirely forgotten. The case became a cautionary tale taught in business schools and ethics classes, an example of how even people in the highest positions could fall prey to greed and rationalization. It sparked ongoing debates about privilege, accountability, and the role of traditional institutions in modern society. For the victims, life slowly moved forward. Some found healing through support groups and counseling. Others channeled their pain into advocacy work, pushing for stronger protections and oversight in the charitable sector. Sarah Mitchell, the mother who had testified so powerfully at trial, became a spokesperson for children's cancer charities, working to ensure that other families would not suffer as hers had. In her prison cell, Camilla spent long hours reflecting on her choices and their consequences. She participated in programs designed to help inmates understand the impact of their crimes and develop empathy for their victims. She read extensively, wrote in a journal, and slowly came to terms with the person she had become and the damage she had caused. The royal halls that had once roared with applause for her were now silent on the subject of Camilla. Her portraits were removed from official galleries. Her name was rarely mentioned in royal circles. Her time as queen consort became a dark chapter that everyone preferred to forget. The monarchy moved forward, working to prove that it could still serve the nation with integrity and honor, that one person's terrible choices did not define the entire institution. Justice had been served, though the scars remained.